I'm going to show you how to set up secure fingerprint-based authentication without using any paid software by using the tools directly built into the browser. And not only does this work for fingerprints, but it works for any other system you can think of. For example, Face ID, if you have passkeys, whether they're on a USB or a password manager, and any other future technology that gets invented. I'm going to explain exactly how to do it and tell you what's happening behind the scenes so you can truly implement this into any application. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name is Kyle and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. And I know it looks like there's a lot of code on the screen, but I'll explain exactly what this does because it's relatively straightforward. At the very top of this file, this is my client-side JavaScript file. I'm just getting all of the inputs and stuff we need. So for example, the sign up button, login button, email input. There's a modal that shows up on our page. So you can see when I click on this, I get a modal that pops up, as well as a close button that just lets me close the modal when I click on it. I set up a few event listeners. So when I click the sign up button, it calls the sign up function. And when I click the login button, it calls the login button function. And then I have this helper function down here just to show text inside my modal. So depending on what I do, I can show slightly different text. So right now this code really doesn't do anything at all. I also have a server URL variable that just points to the URL that our server is running on because we also have an Express server in this application. Again, this code is pretty much doing nothing at all. All I've done is created a really simple Express server. I added in the ability to parse JSON, parse cookies, and I set up cores since we're going to be sending across cookies. And then I just started the server and it has a link down to the client URL. Again, relatively straightforward. It really does nothing at all. It's just a basic server and this is a basic client just giving us an outline for our application. I also am just faking a database for this application. So instead of working with an actual database like you would in a real application, I just have some memory that stores my user information inside of it. You can go ahead and implement your own database. I just figured that we didn't need that in this video since the bulk of this video is all about how you can implement the authentication, and whatever database provider you use, it doesn't matter. Just swap out these individual functions with ones that interact with your database. Now to get started, I'm first going to explain the way that you can set this up by using the tools built directly into the browser. But once we start to get to the point of messing around with the server and authenticating that everything is correct and all of the cryptography associated with that, I'm actually going to lean towards an open source third-party library we can use. It's completely free, completely open source, and it conforms really well to the browser specs. You'll notice when we swap between them, we change almost none of our code. It just helps take care of a few of the things that are a little annoying to do on your own, but otherwise it's all just straight, normal, plain JavaScript. So to get started, to implement the sign up functionality, we're going to be using passkeys for all of this. And passkeys is just a fancy way of saying things like fingerprint identification, Face ID, different USB devices, and so on. These are all different types of passkeys. And to set up a passkey inside of the browser, we're going to use the built-in tool, which is called navigator.credentials, and we have the ability to create and get. Create is going to let us essentially sign up a user by creating a new passkey for them, and get is going to check to see if this device has a passkey on it. Now, before we start diving into actually implementing this create function, we first need to understand what a passkey is. And a passkey is essentially just a way that you can authenticate with an application that you are who you say you are. But the key difference between a passkey and like a password is that passwords are something that you just keep in your memory or maybe a password manager, and then you enter that password every single time you want to log in. A passkey, on the other hand, is usually specifically associated with one device. So for example, on your phone, you have a fingerprint sensor, and that would create a passkey for that particular device, that one phone. If you're using a password manager, it may create a passkey for the individual browser that you signed in with. So like on my computer here, if I sign in on this computer, it's creating a passkey just for this computer. Now, there are types of passkeys that are going to be able to be transferred across different devices, and they use the cloud for that. Or you can have like a USB that you use as a passkey, and you can take that physical USB device with you. It really depends. But the most important thing to understand is most often passkeys are associated with a particular device, so they're not always the best option for purely logging in with them. And they're usually tied together with other types of authentication. For example, you can have two-factor authentication where your fingerprint and your password are used together, or you can have it so they can enter either a password or use their fingerprint or whatever other device they want to use. Also, certain passkeys, like I mentioned, can transfer between different devices, and those can be pretty much used just like a password, but without you having to remember anything at all. So to create a particular passkey, we use this create function, and this can actually be used for tons of different things, but in our case, we want to use a passkey, which is an example of creating a public key credential. Essentially what's going to be happening is we're going to be creating a public key, which we store directly in our database, and then we're going to be saving a private key on the device for the passkey. So my particular computer is going to be saving its own private key. And when I attempt to log in, I'm going to be essentially using this public key and the private key on my device to compare each other to say, okay, you know what, is this device that I think it is? If the private key and the public key work properly together, then I'll know that this is the correct device. That way, I'm making sure that I'm the actual user that's trying to authenticate into this application. And there's actually a ton of information we need to pass to this public key. As you can see, there's a lot of different categories we need to look at. And the very first one is the challenge. A challenge is just going to be an array buffer, essentially. And this is just essentially a long string of numbers or characters or letters. It doesn't really matter what it is, but essentially it's just a random pile of garbage that the server, our server that we have here, is going to send down to the client, and this is used for authenticating that everything went properly. For example, we create this challenge on our server, and we're making sure that when we create this passkey, that the actual passkey gives us the correct challenge on our server. We'll get to that in a little bit. Right now, we're just going to be focusing on the client side of things. So for now, I'm just going to create essentially a new uint8 array, just like that. I'm going to fill it up with just a bunch of random bogus data. It doesn't matter because we're going to be replacing this in a little bit, but this would be coming from your server and is used for authenticating everything went well. Now, the next thing we need to deal with is going to be an RP. Now, the RP stands for relying party, and all this means is where is the server located that this information is being stored on? Rather straightforward. So generally, this is just going to be the URL of your website. And this takes two parameters, a name, which you can call whatever you want. We'll just call this web dev simplified, but generally give it a name associated with your application. And then we can optionally pass it an ID. And this is going to be essentially a URL. So something along the lines of like webdevsimplified.com. Make sure you don't put any HTTPS stuff or anything in front of it. So this is an example here. Or if you just leave this off completely, it's just going to be using the current URL of your page, which is generally probably what you're going to want. Now we have the server information. The next thing we need is our user information, and this is going to be the information of the user that we're creating our passkey for. So we're going to have an ID for our user. It doesn't really matter what this ID is. You know, you can create this on the server. You can let it automatically create. It doesn't matter. I'm just going to come in here and use another uint8 array, and I'm just going to pass whatever into there. Again, this doesn't really matter. We could just create a random ID. But for now, we're just going to be passing in some random information like that. Then I'm going to come in here with a name, and the name is actually like your username. This is the unique identifier associated with this user. So in our case, we're using an email. So I'm just going to pass in an email here, test@test.com, or since we have this email field here, I'm just going to use that right there. Then finally, we have the display name. Now you can leave this blank if you want, or if you have an actual display name for your user, you should probably put this in there. It may be shown to them on their passkey, for example, to help them know what's going on. So we're just going to come in here. We can hard code this as Kyle Cook if we want, or we could just leave it off. It really doesn't make much of a difference. We'll just leave it off because we don't actually have any display name for our user. We just have this email field. Now the final thing we need to add in here is essentially what algorithms do we support, because different passkeys use different algorithms, and that's where this pub key credential params comes from. So we can come in here, we pass it an array, and this array takes both an algorithm and a type. So in our case, all of the types that we're using are public key because we're creating a public key right here. So that's going to be the same no matter what. And then the algorithm here, ALG, this is going to be taking in whatever algorithm we want to use. And it's all based on a numeric numbering system. There's tons of different algorithms you can support, but generally MDN recommends that you use -7. We'll come in here, put a comma, make sure that is there. I'll copy this down. -7, -8, and -257. This is going to give you essentially the widest coverage that you can get for your different algorithms that different passkeys use. You may only need one, maybe two of these, but this is kind of what MDN recommends to give you the widest support possible. Now that's all we need to pass in. Essentially, we have where is the server that this information is going to be stored? What does the user information look like? What algorithms do we support? And then here's a challenge so we can verify that nothing went wrong in the process and that we're getting a legit passkey from a legit passkey provider. Now, if we have all that information, we can kind of just minimize this down a little bit, and I can get the data from that. And let's just make sure we await this because this is an asynchronous function, so it's going to return us a promise. Now we can do a quick console log of that data, and it'll show you all the information that we get. So let's just come in here. I'm going to click this sign up button, and immediately when I click on that sign up button, it looks like things aren't quite working. This is because by default, we actually need to pass in a display name here. So this display name is required. If you don't actually have a display name, just pass in an empty string. That is the recommended way to do things inside of the browser. So now once we have that done, I can actually click the sign up button, but let's come in here and just pass in a simple email. So I click sign up, and you'll notice immediately I use a password manager. So you can see it's actually asking me to save my passkey inside of my password manager. So I'm gonna be like, okay, you know what? I'm gonna be saving this to localhost, which is our URL, and it's gonna be for the user test@test.com, which is what I entered and put as the name for my user. So you can see where those fields are already starting to come in play. You can see that my RP, my relying party, has this local host right here, and it's taking in the name for my user. All of that is being stored. So I can click save, and that's actually going to store that in here. You can see it's been saved, and I get this message, successfully registered test@test.com. Now, if you were on a phone with a fingerprint display, this is where you would be able to enter your fingerprint. If you're on a computer with like Face ID, you could do Face ID instead. It really depends on what your security method is. Now, if we look at the data being returned, we can just inspect real quick. I'll bring this over and we'll look at the actual console for our application. You'll see we get a public key credential, and inside of here we get a bunch of different information. For example, what is the thing that was doing the authenticating? What is my response information? There's just a bunch of different information inside of here. Most importantly, the thing that you're going to be getting out of here is the raw ID, and this is the ID that you essentially want to be able to use and save to be able to authenticate a user at a later date. This is essentially like the ID of that user. So we have our raw ID that we want to make sure we save, so that way we can use that exact same raw ID to check, hey, is this the exact same user that just signed up? So what I'm gonna do, just to make this testing really simple at the beginning, I'm just gonna come in here and I'm gonna say user ID. We'll just call it raw ID. And by default, it's gonna be equal to nothing. So we'll just say let raw ID. And then all the way down here where we get our data, we can say raw ID is equal to data, just like that. There we go. So now what's happening is every time that I go ahead to sign up my user, once it signs them up, it's going to be taking the raw ID from my data and saving it right into this variable right here. And like I mentioned, this is the ID that we use when we want to check to see if this is the correct user. So now that that is done, we can move on to the actual login functionality. And I know right now we haven't implemented the server in any of this. I'm going to be getting to that step next. I just want to show you the basic workflow of how sign up and login works for this process. So we can come into here for login, we have the same email field, and we have some modal that we can show if things are successful. And again, we're going to be using that navigator.credentials, but this time we're going to be using the get function. And luckily, this is a little bit simpler for how we actually do things. So first of all, we have a public key, and this again is going to be taking a challenge that comes from the server, which is specifically used to make sure all of the returned data that we get is actually correct. Because when we call this get or this create function, it's going to give us a bunch of information, and when we're on the server, we can verify everything's correct by comparing the challenge that it gives us back. So inside of here, I'm just going to copy what I had before because we're just going to be putting this in as a placeholder. Again, when we move over to the server, I'll show you how we can actually create that challenge. Now, the next thing we need to do is the allow credentials. And this is just an array of all the different things that we're checking for, all the different passkeys we could possibly be looking for. And that's because, like I mentioned, passkeys are specific to a device. So one single user may have multiple passkeys. They may have one for their phone. They may have one for their desktop computer, their work computer. So you want to pass in an array of all the different passkeys that this particular user could have, and it's going to check this device for all of them until it finds one, and then it's going to use that one particular device. Now in our case, we're only storing one particular passkey for a user because that's our only login method. So we're just going to pass in one value into this array. The type here is going to be public key, and then we need to pass in what the ID is. And that's directly from this raw ID right here. So we're going to come in and just pass in that raw ID. And this is obviously not going to be going to a server or anything like that. This is just using the ID from the actual passkey that we created up here in our signup function and directly using that in the login just to make sure our basic auth workflow actually works. Now, the final thing that we need to pass into here is going to be the RP ID. So RP ID. And again, this is essentially just whatever we pass in up here, or it's going to be the current value for the page that you're on. So our IP ID is just going to be location dot host, just like that. And that should match up to exactly what was automatically generated up here. And that's all we need to do in this section. So we can come in here, we can get the data by awaiting that, and we can come down here, console.log our data, just so we can see what this actually looks like. Give this a quick save. And now I'm going to come in here with test@test.com. I'm going to sign up. And the only reason I'm doing that is so I can store this particular variable in our code. So we'll click sign up, and you'll see it actually already has a passkey for this particular URL with this particular email. I'm just going to click save to update this existing one. And you can see we've been successfully registered. So now let's check logging in. And when I click on login, it looks like it's not quite working. If I inspect and look at the console to see what's going on, you can see down here, the relying party ID is not a registrable domain suffix, blah, 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 blah. The reason for that is this should be host name, but we can actually just leave the RP ID off because it'll use the ID of our current URL, which is exactly what we're doing up here. So it's fine to just completely leave that off. Now, if we give that a save, let's see if everything works. We'll do test@test.com. We're going to click sign up. We're going to update this, close out of all of the different pop-ups that are showing up, and then we're going to click login. And as you can see, it says sign in with passkey. And again, if you used a fingerprint, this is where it would ask you for your fingerprint and so on. And we can click sign in. And if everything's successful, you can see we've been successfully logged in. Now, currently, everything we're doing is just on the client. We're not doing any server-side verification, and we're not storing anything inside of a database. This is where step 2 of the project comes in. We're going to be moving over to the backend and implementing everything that we need on the server to make sure that this is properly authenticated, properly verified, and so that everything is stored on the database for easier login and sign up in the future. Now, the one key caveat here is I'm not going to be doing everything from scratch, and instead I'm going to be using a really simple and easy open source free to use library called Simple Webauthn. The main reason I'm using this library is it takes care of all the cryptographic verification and algorithm stuff on the back end for me and makes writing my code just a little bit easier because there's quite a bit of complicated code we need to write. So the less actual really deep in the weeds cryptographic stuff we need to do, the better. And it's difficult stuff to write if you don't know what you're doing. So I highly recommend using some type of library for this. So if we just open up our terminal real quick, we have both our API on the left and our client on the right. We're just going to be installing a library called Simple Webauthn /browser. That's going to be our client side version. And then we're going to be installing the same exact thing, but we want the server version for our API. So we're just going to install both of those, and these two libraries work really well together. So we're going to say npm run dev, and that's because they actually let you just pass information directly from your server down to your client to make working with everything incredibly easy. So the very first thing I'm actually going to do is go over to my client, and instead of doing all of this code right here, I'm just going to comment this out for now, and we're just going to essentially replace it with the correct code for doing this from the actual library that we're using. So this entire registration process is essentially a two-step process. The very first step is we need to verify someone wants to log in, and that's where we're going to be getting this challenge generated from the server. So step 1 is get challenge from server. Then step 2 is I need to do all of this, essentially. All of this code for creating my passkey I need to do, so we can say create passkey. And then step 3, this is going to be saving it on the server. So we're going to be sending information back to the server. So we have 2 steps on the server and 1 on our client. And this is going to be save passkey in DB. There we go. So these are the 3 different steps that we need to do. So we need to create an API endpoint for both step 1 and 3. And then step 2 is essentially just doing all of the information directly inside of here. So to get started with step 1, all I want to do is just make a simple fetch request to our server. And this is going to be getting my initialization response. So we can say init response, just like that, is going to be called awaiting fetch. And I want to fetch a URL, which is going to our server. So we'll use a server URL variable, which I have defined right here. So that's going to go to our server. And we're going to go to init registration. You can call it init signup, whatever you want to be. This is essentially step 1 of 2 for our server side of things. And I also want to pass along what our email is going to be so we know which user we're trying to actually register. We're saying, okay, we want to register a user with this particular email right here. Also, since I'm going to be making use of cookies to be able to store information between request 1 and this request in step 3, we also want to come in here and just say that we're going to have credentials and set that to include. This just allows us to actually pass a cookie from our server to our client and from our client to our server. It's not really super important to know what this does right now because I'm going to be explaining why we're using those cookies in just a little bit. So this is going to give us back our particular response. And this response is going to include all the options that we pass into this function right here. So this entire section for passing in all these options is taken care of in step 2, and all those options come from this response. So we can come in here and say options is equal to taking this init response, getting the JSON from it, and just awaiting that just like that. So now we can come in here and actually create our passkey. But first we should probably verify that everything went right. So we can say if our init response .ok. If it is not okay, well, then we want to show some modal text, and we're just going to say options.error. So it's going to pass down an error to us from our API if there's any type of error. Otherwise, everything is going to go fine. So if there's an error, we're going to pass it down here. Otherwise, we're going to come in here and actually create our passkey. So let's do that. We can say start registration. That comes directly from our library. You can see we're importing that up here. And let me make sure that this is actually using import statements. So we're going to import that from this library. There we go. So we have that function coming in, and this function is just going to take in the options that we get from our server. This is going to include the challenge as well as all of this other information. All of that's coming down directly from the server, so we know it's verified information that's exactly what we want it to be. Now this is going to give us back information very similar to how this function gave us a bunch of data. This is going to give us a bunch of data that we need to store inside of our server and also verify to make sure everything's correct, because if for some reason someone changes this challenge or they change other information inside of here and then they send it back to our server, we want to know that they have changed that information, which is where this final third step comes in to save our information and to also verify it. So let's get the information. We'll call this registration JSON, just like that. And this is an async function, so we're going to await it, because essentially all it's doing behind the scenes is calling this function. And you'll notice when we move to the actual backend API, you'll notice a lot of this code looks almost identical because it's really just copy pasted, just a slightly easier to use API. So we're going to move down to saving the passkey, and that's almost going to be identical to what we did for our initialization, but this is going to be for our verify, because we want to verify and save this information. We'll call this verify right here, and we don't need to pass along any email. So we're just going to call our verify registration API endpoint. This one is going to be a post request. So we'll say method is post, just like that. And also we need to pass along some headers because we know that this is going to be JSON. So we can say content type is application/JSON. And that's because we need to pass along all of the information inside this registration JSON. So we can come in here and we're going to say that we're going to have a body, which is JSON.stringify of that registration JSON. So we're making sure that we can pass along cookies. We're making sure this is a post request. We're making sure that we actually can pass along JSON. And then finally here, we're passing along the actual JSON data we need. So if we kind of refresh what's going on here, first, we're initializing the registration by getting all the information from our server, including that challenge. That's the key point right here. Then what we're doing is we're coming along and we're creating the passkey on the device. So since this is my computer, I'm creating a passkey specific to this individual computer. If you're on a phone, it'll be a passkey for your phone with a fingerprint, for example. And then finally, I'm taking all that information that I'm getting and I'm passing it up to our server to both save and verify that it's correct information. Now, this is going to give us back some information from our API, and we're just going to be essentially getting a true false variable from here. So I can get my verify data, which is just await verify response.json. And then again, I can check to make sure everything's okay. So I'll just copy this code down. If my verify response is not okay, then I want to show an error. So this is verify data.error. Again, it's going to come directly from our API. And then finally down here, I can just have a simple check that says if verify data.verified, which is going to come from our API, it'll be true or false. If it is true, well, then we have a successful registration. I'm just going to copy this show right here up into there. So we're going to show this to our people. Otherwise, if there's some type of error, we'll just show a different modal that says failed to register. There we go. Now we can essentially remove all of this code right here. We no longer need it. So we can just delete that. There we go. And all we have really here is our 3 steps. Get the challenge from the server, create the passkey, and then finally save and verify that information. We just need to go ahead and implement all of this on the server side to make sure it actually works, because right now we're really not doing much on the client at all other than checking our API responses and passing them around to each other. So let's go over to the server to actually look at what these different API endpoints are going to look like. The first one that I'm going to get here is going to be for initializing that response. So we'll say init register, put a slash in the front right there. This is going to be an asynchronous function with our request and our response, just like that. Now, the first thing we want to do is just get the email and verify things. So I'm just going to paste in the code here. You can see I'm getting my email from the query string and I'm checking, okay, if we don't have an email, obviously throw an error because we need an email. And then I want to check, do we already have a user with that email? If so, just let them know the user already exists so we don't create another passkey for that user. Now, if you're in a situation where people are creating passkeys for accounts that they've already signed into, you probably wouldn't have this check because you would already have the user and you want them to be able to add multiple passkeys. But in our case, we're using this as our only sign-in method, which is why we're checking if there's already a user. Obviously, don't let them create another account with the same email. Now, the next step we want to do is to be able to create that challenge as well as all the other options that we need to be able to pass along to this function right here. Essentially, it's all those options that I just deleted that we had commented out. So I can say our options is going to be equal to calling the generate registration options function, just like that. And this is coming from that library. So let me come all the way to the top up here. Const, there we go, equals require, and that's from that simple auth library. There we go. So we're getting that being passed in, and this is going to take in essentially all the same options we're already used to. We need to pass in our RPID. So we can come in here and pass that in. So let's just create a constant variable for that up here, const RPID, In our case, that is just localhost. There we go. So we can pass along our RP ID. There we go. Then we need our RP name. Well, again, we can call this whatever we want. We called it Web Dev Simplified, so that's what I'm just going to keep this as. Essentially, it's whatever your actual application name is. If you're Spotify, you would call this Spotify. Then what we're going to do in here is we're going to pass along the user name. This is that name property inside the user field. And this is, in our case, is just going to be their email. And you'll notice we can still pass along all these other things, and you'll notice they all look identical to things that we'd passed in before, like the user display name, their ID, the challenge, and so on. But if you leave certain things blank, like the ID or the challenge, it's just going to automatically generate those for us. And since we don't have an ID for a user and we don't want to make our own challenge, we'll just let all of those get automatically generated for us. And that'll give us some options that we can use, and these options we can pass back down to our client. So we can console log these out so we can see what they look like in just a little bit. But we can also go ahead and we can send that information down to the client. So we're going to res.json all of these different options. So actually, I'm just going to move my console log for the options down into here so we can take a look at what that looks like. So all the way up here, we can just add in console.log of options. There we go. And then we can see what this looks like. We can just type in test@test.com and we can click this sign up button. Obviously, nothing's going to happen yet because we haven't finished this final part of our section. But if we inspect our page, we can look at our console and see what's working. Looks like we have a bunch of errors. And if we go over to the network tab, it actually looks like the reason for this is a 404 not found. So it looks like this is called verify registration. I think I just called it verify register. And up here, I think I called this register as well. Let me check. You can see here, I called that init register. Okay, so that should be better. Let's just come in here, test.com, click sign up. And of course, it's getting to the creation of our passkey, which is great. So that means step 1, this worked. Step 2 also worked. If I were to click save, I'm just going to close out of this because I don't really want to do that right now. But we can go ahead and inspect our console and we can look at that object being returned and look at this object. You'll notice it looks very familiar. We have our challenge, we have our extensions, we have the RP, we have the user information, all of these different things that you can manually set yourself. It's just generated all of them for us, which is incredibly useful and really nice. So now we can move on to the third and most important step is once they actually create their passkey, we want to save that information in our database and verify that everything is correct. So we have our initialization done. Let's move on down to say app.post, post, and this is going to be for verify register. It's going to be an async function with a request and a response. And inside this function, what we're going to do is we're going to use the verify registration response. This is going to give us a bunch of information about our verification if we await this. And in here, we pass it along all the important information. The first thing we want to pass along is the body. So this body is coming directly from here. This is our registration JSON that comes straight from our starting of our registration. So remember when we were originally calling this with the browser APIs, when we got things like the raw ID and so on, this is going to be all of that information in an easy to read format that we're passing to here. And it's going to check things like making sure that nothing was tampered with between the time we sent it out with our server and the time that we got it back. And the way that it does that is by using the challenge. So we can expect what the challenge should be. And it should be the exact same challenge that we used up here inside of our register. So this is automatically creating a challenge for us. And this options object actually has a challenge. You can see options.challenge. So we need to make sure our challenge from part 1 is exactly the same as our challenge from part 2. That's where our expected challenge comes in. And this is where the idea of cookies comes in. There's lots of different ways you can save information from one request to another, but cookies are going to be about the easiest way for us to do that. So up here, we actually want to create a cookie that's going to store, for example, our challenge, as well as all the information for the user that we're creating. So up here, what we can do is we can say res.cookie. That's going to allow us to create a new cookie. We can call it whatever we want for the name. So I'm just going to come in here. We're going to call this reg info for registration info. And then we're just going to json.stringify an object of all the information we want. So we're just going to be storing essentially a JSON object that has our user ID, which is our options.user.id. That's coming from this options right here. It's automatically generated. We want to pass along the email for our user. And then finally, the challenge is just options.challenge, just like that. So we're essentially saving this information in our cookies. And that way, when our request for sign up goes back into step 3, so step 1, we're passing down that cookie and it's being saved in the browser. And then step 3, we're passing that cookie back up. So it'll have all of the exact same information. Now, to make sure none of this information gets actually tinkered with at all, what we can do inside of here is we can pass along some other properties. For example, HTTP only. We can set that to true. We can set a max age. I'm going to be setting this to 6,000. That'll essentially make it last for 1 minute, which is more than long enough because all it needs to do is last for the entire time that this request happens. You can make it last longer or shorter. It's really up to you, but this just makes sure that this cookie doesn't stick around for too long. And we're going to make it secure, so we'll say secure of true. That's just doing everything we can to make sure that this cannot be tampered with on the browser. Since it's HTTP only and secure, there's no way for anyone to mess with this cookie. So now we've created that cookie, we've gone along past our JSON, now we can actually get that cookie inside of here. So I can say const reg info is equal to json.parse. I don't want to parse that cookie, request.cookies.reg info, just like that. And if for some reason we do not have that registration info, there we go, then what we can do is we can just essentially log out that this was not found. Just an error that we can throw down to the user, really doesn't matter. So now that we have that cookie, we can come in here and say reginfo.challenge, and that's going to give us the challenge that we used in part 1 because we're using that same cookie. Now the only other things we need to get are the expected origin, and this is just going to be whatever our client URL is. So we can get that from up there. That is our client URL. And then we have the expected RPID, which is our RPID, just like that. So this verification is going to go through and say, okay, here's all the information the client sent me. Here's all the information I expect to be in there. And it's going to check, is this information correct, not tampered with, and exactly as I expect it to be? If so, then we know that this is a correct passkey that we can save in our database and the user is properly authenticated. If it doesn't verify, well, that means someone messed with this information along the ways. Usually it's someone trying to do something malicious, so we want to reject this completely. So let's create a simple if to check if the verification worked. If verification.verified, well, that means everything worked perfectly fine, so we can go ahead further with our thing. So we can first create a user in our database. So we can say create user just like that. And inside of here, I'm going to be passing along my reginfo.userid, my reginfo.email, and then finally, I'm passing along all the information for my passkey. And that's because users in my database, they have an ID, they have an email, and then they have all the information for the passkey associated with that particular user. Now, the most important things that you want to store are as follows. First of all, you're going to need the ID of it. So this comes from our verification.registrationinfo.credential ID. This is going to be like that raw ID that I showed you earlier. This is how we associate a particular device with the actual user. Then we're going to want to have their actual public key that they're using. So we can have the public key just like that. And this is verification.registrationinfo.credential public key. There we go. We also want to store the counter. This essentially associates how many times they've used this device to log in, and it's an extra level of security that we can use. So verification.registrationinfo.counter. Then we can get the device type. And all of this information is just making sure that we can really easily know exactly which passkey the user is using. You may or may not need all of these, but these are the minimum recommended to store just to make sure everything's working fine. So this comes from the verification registration info, and we can get the device type from here. So credential device type. Then we want to get the backed up property, which is going to be verification.registration.backedup, which is credential backed up. And then finally, we want to get the transports. And this transports actually comes from our body. So we can come in here, request.body.transports. And the transports is just kind of a fancy way of saying how exactly does this actual passkey work. There's a few different options, and this will just let you know which ones they are. And we can use that information to help with actually making sure we use the correct passkey when a user tries to log in the next time, because if they have multiple on their device, we'll know which one they actually signed up with. Finally, after we create our user, I want to get rid of our cookie. So we'll call clear cookie, and we'll pass it in the name of that cookie, just so we no longer have that being stored on the browser. And then finally, we can return some JSON to the user. So we'll say return some JSON, verified, and this is going to be if we are verified. So if it's true, it's passed down true. If it's false, it'll pass down false. Finally, we'll come in here with a simple else statement, and we'll just return an error code, something along the lines like verification failed. Doesn't really matter what it is. It's just some way to let the user know something went wrong along this process. I also should probably specify that verified is false, just so we know that it is absolutely 100% failed. And this right here, if we typed in everything correctly, should actually do the entire sign up process for us and create a user in our database. So let's go ahead and see if this works. We'll just refresh our page down here, test@test.com, and I'm going to click sign up. And you can see it's creating a new passkey for me. So step 1 went off flawlessly. We're on step 2 right now. And when I click save, it's going to go through step 3. You can see it says our passkey has saved and everything looks to be working properly, but I'm not getting any information showing up down here for my modal showing. So clearly there's still something going on that's not quite right. If we look inside of our console, you'll notice I'm getting an error on my server. So let's just expand that and see exactly what our error is. Right now it says undefined is not valid JSON. And that looks like it's coming from our application right here when it's trying to parse our cookie. So our cookie's not properly being saved. I think the problem is that I need to make this slightly longer. I think it's currently set to 6 seconds and I want this to be 60 seconds, which would be 1 minute. That way it'll actually last long enough to go through the entire process. You could even make it a little bit longer if you wanted, for example, an hour. It doesn't really matter. We'll just keep it at a minute here and this should hopefully work. So let's go ahead, we'll click sign up. You can see we're saving our passkey, it's working properly, and we've been successfully registered. So it did go through the entire process, and it was just a matter of the fact that I took longer than 6 seconds. Now with a full minute, that should be more than enough for someone to set up a passkey, but again, you can make it longer or shorter depending on your needs. And also inside of our database, we now have a user being stored in that database. So we can actually get that user information. So what I could do is when we're creating our user down here, I could just console.log all of my users. So I can just say get user by email, and we can pass in our email, which is from reginfo.email, just like that. Now, since my database is being stored just in memory, every time I change this file, it's going to completely delete my database. So we can actually create a brand new user with the same email because the old one was deleted. So we'll click sign up. You can see update existing. Yep. And I was successfully registered. So if I go ahead and I look in my console, you can see I get all the information for this user being stored. For example, I get the ID, I get my email, and then I get all of the different information related to my passkey being stored inside of here, which is exactly what I want. Now, if I try to create another user with the same email, if I click sign up, you can see it's telling me the user already exists. And if I go ahead and create someone with a new email and I click sign up, it should hopefully all go through the process fine, but it looks like there's a little bit of an error happening. It's not quite working. Now I'm just going to refresh the page over here and try it again, test2@test.com. And that's because sometimes my password manager doesn't really like how the modal interface works because they kind of both use the same little bits of code, but hopefully that should work. And as you can see, it did successfully register them. And now inside of my database, I have 2 separate users being rendered. I have test@test.com and test2@test.com. So now let's go ahead and move on to the login section. And this is actually really easy because it's almost copy and paste the exact same code. So we can come in here, I'm going to take everything inside my signup function, and I'm just going to directly copy that down into my login function. And you'll notice that almost everything stays exactly the same because we have the same exact 3-step process. We need to first get all the challenge information from the server. Then we need to, instead of creating a passkey, we need to get a passkey, and then we just need to verify passkey with our database. So these are our 3 steps: get the challenge, get the passkey, and then verify all the information is correct. So here we're going to be initializing an authentication attempt. So we'll call this init auth, and that's going to give us back all of our information. And we're literally changing nothing else. We're just changing the endpoint that we hit, and we're getting back all of our options, including that challenge. Then we're going to be getting our auth JSON from here by coming in here and starting our authentication process. So this is going to be doing a login request instead of a create request. Then we're going to be coming in here and verifying that our response is correct. So we're verifying that passkey with our database. This is going to be calling verify auth, which is our new URL. Instead of our registration JSON, it'll be passing in our auth JSON. Then finally, we have our verification data, and you can see we have successfully logged in or we have failed to log in. That's literally it. Everything else in all of the different steps is exactly the same. The only difference is going to be what happens on the server. And that's because we have the same 3-step process: get the challenge, create or get the passkey, and then finally verify everything. Now I'm going to clean up the code a little bit by getting rid of these console logs. And also I called this registrations instead of registration. So I'm just going to be fixing that quick typo. So there we go. We can now minimize this down. We don't need this raw ID, so I'm going to remove that completely. And now we have our login essentially completely done. So we can hopefully minimize that and move on to our server side of things, which again is still going to be somewhat similar. We're just going to be doing our init and verify functions. So app.get, this one is for init of our authentication, and this is going to be for creating the challenge, which we can use later in the verify step to make sure everything was legit and worked as we expected it to. So this is an async request and response. And the very first thing I want to do is just basic verification. I want to get the email. If it doesn't exist, let them know. And then I'm going to get the user by email. If there is no user with that email, I'm just going to let them know. You can choose to let them know however you want. I'm just saying, hey, you know what? There's no user for this particular email. Then we need to go ahead and call the generate authentication options. Notice it's very similar to what we did up here, but we generated some registration options. We're pretty much going to be doing the same exact thing down here. So we're going to be doing that. And of course, we need our RP ID. So we're going to pass in our RP ID. And then we need our allow credentials. This is that same array from the beginning of the video where we're passing in the ID as well as the type and so on. So the ID inside of here is going to be based on our user. We want to get their passkey, just like that. And we want to get the ID from that passkey. Then our type is just going to be public key. There we go, just like it's always been. And then finally, we can specify the transports we want, which again are saved on our user passkey.transports. And the reason that we're passing along these transports is, again, just to make it easier. For example, if my device had a USB passkey, a password manager passkey, and a fingerprint passkey all in one, this would help narrow down which ones the browser should actually tell the user to use, or if you're on a mobile device, what it should tell you to use for those particular use cases. Now, this is going to give us back some options. So we can make sure we await that to get our options, and we can pass those options down to the user. So we can res JSON our options, and then we should create a cookie again, so that way we can verify that the challenge that comes from here is the same as the challenge in part 2. So we can say res.cookie. This cookie, we're going to give a name of auth info to save this information, and then we're going to json.stringify an object which contains all the information we want. We want our user ID, and then our challenge, which comes from our options.challenge. There we go. And then finally, we want to do the exact same things we did up here for our cookie to make sure it's secure. So we're just going to copy this exact line, and we're going to paste it down into here, just making it HTTP only, lasting for a minute, and secure. Now, to test to see if this half of our application has actually worked, let's first sign up with a user, test@test.com, click sign up, and you can see it looks like everything inside of here worked exactly as we expect. Next up, we can try logging in, and it looks like I may need to just reset my browser because, again, it doesn't really like how the modals work. But when I click login, it looks like things aren't quite working. Let me inspect our page to see what's going on in the console. We can see here, failed to do a fetch. So there's clearly something going wrong. Connection was refused. This is called a init auth. Let's make sure we actually called that correctly up here. This is a init auth, so that does look correct. Looks like there might be an error on our server. Let's check. And of course, in our logs, we do see that we have an error. If we scroll up, you can see it's unable to read the ID of my passkey from my user. So something's going wrong with maybe creating my user properly and so on. But we do know the user is being created properly. So let me make sure. I'm going to check my database. When we create a user, we're passing in the passkey, but it's with a capital K, and it looks like I use a lowercase k down here. So this should be passkey. Same thing anywhere else we're using that. I think that's the only place inside of here. So that should hopefully fix our function problems. This is why I almost always use TypeScript when I'm writing code, because it solves errors like this from happening. So now let's go ahead and test this. We already signed up with this user, but we need to re-sign up since we changed this file. So I'm going to click sign up, update existing, close out of everything. And I'm just going to refresh the page just because, again, I'm having problems with my password manager specifically. Now I'm going to click login, and you can see it's currently asking me to sign in. I click sign in, and it's not going to sign me in. And that's because if we go over here, we haven't finished step 3 yet. This API does not exist. But at least we know step 1 and step 2 are working. All we need to do is verify that this sign in attempt is actually correct and actually sign the user in. So in our server, we can minimize this down, and we can move on to the next step, which is going to be our verify of our authentication. And this is an async request. There we go. Now, the very first thing I want to do in here is, again, a bunch of verification. First, I want to make sure my cookie exists. And if this cookie exists, I can just, let them know it doesn't. And then I want to check to make sure we have a user with this ID and that their actual passkey matches the ID of the passkey we're sending up. So I'm not only just checking to make sure the user is legit, but I'm also making sure that the passkey that's coming from the browser is one associated with this particular user. Otherwise, we're throwing an error. Then finally, we can come in here with the verify authentication response, and this is going to be passing in all the information. Of course, we need to pass it in our body because we're passing up a bunch of information from here. As you can see, all this information from our body, we want to make sure we pass that up because that's all of the passkey information for our user. Then we just need to make sure everything is expected to work as properly. So you can see we have all these different expected things we need. So expected challenge, well, that comes from my auth info .challenge. That's in that cookie that I just created. Then we can come in here and get the expected origin, which is just going to be our client URL. We need to get our expected RPID, which is our RPID, just like that. All of this information is exactly what we expect it to be. And then finally, we need to specify what the actual authenticator for this is going to be. So this is going to have a credential ID, which is our user.passkey.id. We also need to make sure that the public key is correct. So this is our user.public key. and that's coming from our passkey, just like that. So this is just making sure that all the information coming from the passkey is the correct passkey. This is all that verification and authentication stuff going on. Our counter should be the exact same as our user's passkey.counter. And then finally, the transport should also be the same, user.passkey.transports. There we go. Now, if we give that a quick save, that should do all of our verification. It's making sure our request has not been tampered with and that the passkey is the same passkey stored in our server for the user. So let's come in here. We're going to get our verification just like that. And the rest of this is pretty much going to be identical to what we have up here. And this is just going to be our verification. So I'm going to copy this, paste it all the way down here. But instead of creating a user, we just want to update the counter for that user. So for verification, it comes with some authentication info. Of course, we need to make sure we await that up here. There we go. Clean up our code a little bit. We get our authentication info, and inside of here, we have a new counter. This is going to be the new counter for how many times this authentication method has been used. We can get rid of these console logs because we don't actually need these anymore. And then we can, of course, clear out this cookie for our authentication info, pass down if it has actually worked, and if it failed, we'll say the verification failed. And that should be everything we need to do to make this work. So let's refresh our page, test@test.com. I'm going to sign up, update the existing one, and there we go. We successfully created this user. Everything appears to be working fine. Now I'm just going to refresh again because my password manager does not like the modals, and click login. You can see it's asking me to sign in. I click sign in, and it looks like there's probably a problem going on because it didn't quite work. If we inspect our page, go over to the console, we're getting some errors with our fetch request, and it looks like maybe in our server we have an error. Let me scroll down, and it does look like we crashed inside of here. So it says that passkey again does not exist. I forgot to capitalize the K somewhere, it looks like. So let me just search for passkey and see where I forgot to put the capital K. It looks like all of these have a capital K, so that should be correct. Actually, it looks like the error is inside my update user counter, and that's because when I called this, I forgot to tell it what user to update. We need to pass along the ID for the user we want to update our counter for. That should solve the problem. So now let's go ahead, click sign up, save this as an existing one. There we go, close out of all that. We're going to try to log in, click sign in here, and look at that, we successfully logged in. Now, if you're actually doing an authentication system like that, right here, before you pass along your response, this is where you would actually authenticate the user by using a authentication session cookie, JWT, whatever you want to use. Now you know you have a successfully authenticated user, so you would save them in a session cookie or something like that. Whatever your authentication method is for using authentication throughout your rest of your application, that's going to go right into here. Now, the reason I'm not covering that in this video is because it doesn't matter if you use passkeys, password list, doesn't matter how you authenticate the user. This step is always exactly the same. If you're interested in learning more about this session-based cookie, I believe I have a few videos on it. I'll link them in the cards and description for you. There's a lot of other modern authentication features besides passkeys, such as passwordless authentication and JWTs. So if you want to learn more about those, I have videos on both of them linked right over here. With that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.